Picture yourself at age 14, strapped to a chair, blindfolded, and awaiting your death. As the executioners place wet sponges and strap a metal helmet to the top of your head, you begin to hyperventilate. The executioners then flip the switch, and you feel a sharp, searing pain. This lasts for about 15 to 20 seconds before your heart stops and you die. Now, this may sound like a morbid story, but fortunately, it was all but a reality for a young boy who was age 14 named George Stinney from South Carolina. In the 1940s, Stinney was wrongfully executed. Stinney was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of two small white women in his town. Now, the case against Stinney was not an isolated one. All across the U.S., many innocent people have been sentenced to death for crimes they simply did not commit. Death penalty in the U.S. is greatly flawed. It must be abolished due to it being racially biased, having a history of convicting innocent people, and being more costly. The United States has a long history of racial injustice, and the death penalty is just one example of this. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, African Americans make up 42% of those on death row and 34% of those executed. Now, African Americans are also only make up 13% of the population. This is concerning, especially if we look back on the history of the death penalty. The death penalty started to be used against African Americans heavily in the 1930s due to mass murder lynchings like these, drawing criticism and undermining America's image and moral authority on the world stage. The people lynched here often had a rush trial or no trial at all, and the lynchings would happen in the middle of towns for all to see. Usually they would be lynched on lampposts, trees, or even gallows. And by the 1950s, 75% of those executed in the South were black. And this is terrible considering that so many of these people have done nothing wrong. Not only does the death penalty have a history of racial bias, but also has a history of convicting the innocent. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, more than 170 people since 1973 who had been wrongly convicted and sentenced to death in the U.S. have been exonerated. Now, this is far too many people to be wrongly convicted of the highest form of capital punishment, which is death. One such example of this is a case of a man named Anthony Hinton. Hinton was on death row for nearly 30 years before he was released in 2015. Hinton was accused of murdering and robbing two fast food managers in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1980s. At the time of the crime, Hinton was nowhere near the crime scene, and prosecutors claimed that a revolver found from his mother's home was the murder weapon, even though no DNA testing or fingerprint analysis on the weapon had been conducted. Hinton's case was presented in front of an all-white courtroom, much like George Stinney's. We must end this injustice in our judiciary system. Now, some may say that the death penalty is cheaper than life in prison, and this is simply not true. The median cost, according to the balance, the median cost for death penalty trials is over $500,000 compared to about $33,000 for non-death penalty trials. And the cost of a full case, if the death penalty is sought on, is on average about $1.2 million, compared to about $740,000 for non-death penalty cases. Now, this is a staggering number considering that most people on death row die due to natural causes or get their cases repealed and their sentences switched to a life sentence instead of death. Regardless, most states spend way too much money maintaining their capital punishment system. One such example of this is the state of Louisiana, who between 2008 and 2017 spent $15.6 million each year to maintain its capital punishment system. And would you like to guess how many people they executed during this time? It's only one. They executed a single person and spent $15.6 million each year, where they could have been investing this money into the communities to where these violent crimes, to prevent these violent crimes that cause these death penalty cases from even happening. Now, as I close here, I would like to offer you a moment to think if taking a life is truly worth it. Today, we went over why we should abolish the death penalty, including it being racially biased, having a history of convicting innocent people, and being more costly. Thank you.